Imagine you're sitting in your peaceful living room in California, 2018. Suddenly, boom, the police surround a house. The person dragged out is a 72-year-old man, wrinkled face, pot belly, looking like your neighbor's grumpy uncle. But wait, he's no ordinary uncle. This is the Golden State Killer, the monster that has been terrorizing for 40 years. And his real name is Joseph James DeAngelo. Yes, surprise? A former cop. The man he swore to protect is actually the one who haunts in the dark. And today, we're going to tear apart that shell of normalcy to see how much crime is buried inside. On a summer night in 1976 in Sacramento, no one could have imagined that the houses located close together with green lawns and the chirping of insects would become the scene of a nightmare. In a small house in the Rancho Cordova area, a family had just fallen asleep when the rear window shook slightly. A figure quietly slipped in. He was wearing gloves, a ski mask, and a flashlight shining directly on the sleeping husband's face. The dream was torn apart by the bright light and the presence of a stranger. A cold gun pointed straight at his head. The man only had time to jump up and then stopped when he heard a whisper, but sharp as a knife. "Stay still, don't move." The wife was startled when she saw the dark body approaching. The smell of sweat and rubber from the gloves made the air heavy and suffocating. In a few seconds, peaceful life turned into a horror play. He tied up the husband, blindfolded the wife, then dragged out each minute as if enjoying the feeling of agony. Treatment. As the flashlight swept through each room, he rummaged through drawers, opened a refrigerator, took out some food, and munched leisurely as if he were at home. The tied-up husband heard the sound of knives tapping on plates, the crunching of chewing, and his heart pounding. Humiliation tormented him, knowing that his wife was right there, helpless before the attacker's hands. In the darkness, the man whispered incoherent sentences, sometimes repeating the same meaningless word over and over, sometimes giggling like a child. It was that sound that instilled in the victim a fear more terrible than the knife or the gun. Such attacks were not isolated. From late 1976 to 1977, more than 30 cases with identical motifs occurred in the Sacramento area and surrounding areas. The press began to call him the East Area Rapist. The police made maps, pinning each case on a large board, but the red dots only grew denser. They increased patrols, but he was like a ghost, disappearing just when people thought they were close to catching him. In one case, the police arrived within minutes, but all that remained was a rope, shoe prints on the damp ground, and victims trembling with fear. People lived in a state of constant tension. Families who never locked their doors now bought new locks, bought guard dogs, and hung wind chimes outside their doors as a precaution. Community meetings were packed with people discussing how to protect each other, but each new case proved that all measures were ineffective. He always knew how to choose the right house at the right time. Women living alone, young couples, or families who had just moved and all became targets. Sometimes he followed his victims for days, memorizing their habits, just waiting for a moment of vulnerability. Many victims recounted that before the attack, they heard strange noises in the garden. Sometimes a window was ajar. Sometimes the back gate was slightly askew. Some received strange phone calls, only breathing in the other end of the line. Police later determined that these were his sick preludes, his way of instilling fear before he struck. His sophistication and patience showed that he was not an impulsive person, but a cold-blooded predator. In 1978, when the entire Sacramento area was haunted, a bloody turn occurred. A young couple was brutally murdered in their home, a far cry from the previous motif. This time it was not just tying, blindfolding, and raping, but murder. He had crossed a new line, and from then on, his criminal path became more and more brutal. The media reported loudly. The police were under tremendous pressure. Other nicknames began to appear: Original Night Stalker, Diamond Knot Killer. But no name changed the fact that California was haunted by a ghost. The fear did not stop in Sacramento. Neighboring counties such as Contra Costa, Santa Barbara, Orange all recorded received attacks with familiar traces. Police from many localities tried to cooperate, but in the 70s there was no interconnected data system. The The fragmented clues were difficult to piece together into a complete picture. Each place saw only a part of the monster, and he took advantage of that fragmentation to continue his actions. During this period, the killer's descriptions were vague. People said he was medium-sized, sturdy, aged between 20 and 30, usually dressed in dark clothes, and always covered his face. No one saw his face clearly. No one knew his real voice because he always whispered or faked his voice. He could be anyone, a neighbor, a passerby, even a police officer. His invisibility made him a collective obsession, someone everyone suspected but no one could name. By the late 1970s, the number of cases had exceeded 50, and he seemed unstoppable. Families lived in a state of heightened alert. Children were not allowed outside after 9 o'clock at night. Men carried clubs or pistols in the house, and women slept in constant fear. A barking dog or a flickering porch light was enough to wake the entire neighborhood. Newspaper headlines read, "Who's next? Where's the ghost tonight?" Every Californian felt they could be targeted. Yet, despite the stress and effort of the investigation, he disappeared into the darkness after each case. The police followed hundreds of leads, from size 9 sneakers to a distinctive braided rope, from faint fingerprints on the window to vague witness statements. But everything led to dead ends. There was no DNA, no surveillance cameras, and forensic technology was not yet strong enough to expose him. All they knew was that there was a sick man out there enjoying the game of prey, and it was not over yet. Sacramento's summer nights were never peaceful again. Streets that once echoed with laughter were now filled with a heavy silence. Each house became a makeshift fortress, but even in that fortress, people still did not feel safe. The East Area rapist attacked not only the body, but also the mind, turning every half-closed door into a threat. Every darkness began as Sacramento sank into long, haunting nights. People thought the serial rapist might stop after dozens of cases, but the nightmare did not subside and escalated into unprecedented brutality. In the final months of 1978, a young couple was murdered in their own home. Violence and blood filled the once peaceful bedroom, and from then on, California no longer knew him as just the East Area rapist, but faced a killer with intent. He had crossed the line from what had previously been a threat and humiliation to ending lives, a sickening evolution that left the police both bewildered and desperate. They were no longer chasing a man hiding in the shadows to satisfy his animalistic desires, but now a monster ready to take the life of anyone who dared to resist. The case of Brian and Katie Majori marked a clear shift. That evening, they were walking their dog near their apartment when they encountered a stranger, a brief encounter that turned tragic, as both were shot dead on the spot. Gunfire echoed through the neighborhood, terrifying neighbors, and police began to question, had the East Area rapist become a serial killer? His escalating nature could no longer be hidden. The following years saw a series of horrific murders across California. In Santa Barbara, a couple were tied up and brutally murdered, the rope knotted so intricately that he seemed to be displaying some kind of sick skill. In Irvine, a young family was attacked in the middle of the night, the wife raped and murdered in front of her husband and children. He changed his tactics, no longer targeting women living alone or young couples, but now anyone who caught his eye could be a victim. What was more terrifying was the calculation. He often cut off the phone before breaking in, prepared ropes, prepared weapons, and even ate and drank in the victim's house to assert his absolute power. Each action showed coldness and patience. The police at that time fell into a deadlock. There was no DNA database, no surveillance cameras, and the semen samples collected from the scene were only stored and could not be analyzed for comparison. Teams of investigators continued to plow through the files, reconstructing the killer's journey through each shoe print, each bloodstain, but all stopped in obscurity. From Sacramento to Ventura, from Contra Costa to Orange County, the red dots on the map stretched for hundreds of miles. The name Original Night Stalker appeared when the murders became popular in Southern California, and the press called him the Diamond Knot Killer because of the complex knots he left on the ropes. Behind each case was a community immersed in horror. The once quiet suburbs became a dead zone, where everyone whispered suspicions about their neighbors. People said the killer could be a police officer because he was so knowledgeable about tactics, always knew how to hide, always knew how to mislead. In fact, people later discovered that suspicion was not unreasonable because Joseph James DeAngelo had been a police officer in Exeter and Auburn. But at that time, everything was still dark. Survivors described the gruesome details. He often whispered in the dark, his voice hoarse and deliberately changed. He took dishes from the kitchen and placed them on the back of the tied husband, and warned that if he heard the sound of dishes falling, he would kill his wife immediately. This obsession made the man lie motionless for hours, listening to him move around the house, his wife sobbing, the sound of the rope rubbing against her skin. Every second was torture. It wasn't just physical abuse, it was psychological torture that continued indefinitely. Each case followed another like a never-ending chain of horrors. He never stayed in one area for long. After a few consecutive cases, he disappeared, then reappeared in another city hundreds of miles away. There was little federal coordination between the county police, and records were not widely shared, and the killer took advantage of this loophole to continue his sick game. Meanwhile, the press gave him many different nicknames, but none were enough to fully describe his escalating violence. By the early 1980s, he had become a ghost across California. On dark nights in the Los Angeles suburbs, people slept in fear. Everyone prepared weapons in their bedrooms. Many taught their children to run to the neighbor's house if they heard noise. Self-defense classes and community seminars were packed. But no amount of effort can lessen the haunting feeling when the press reports on a new case, a new couple, a new family falling at the hands of the Invisible Man. This chapter not only recounts the murders, but also shows the cold evolution of a predator. He started out as a serial rapist. He sowed fear in Sacramento, but gradually he became a ruthless, intelligent, and persistent serial killer. Each escalation was deliberate, each victim a link in his sick power game. California, with its bright sunshine and green suburbs, was now dyed by the shadow of a monster. In all those years, no one knew that the terror spreader was a father, a husband, a former police officer, living in the community like any other normal person, with two opposing faces, a friendly neighbor by day, a devil by the silence that followed the years of terror, when the ghost known as the East Area Rapist, or the original Night Stalker, seemed to disappear from the crime map, leaving behind a series of unclosed files, broken families, survivors with permanently damaged minds, and a state of California that no longer knew what peaceful sleep was. In the mid-1980s, after a string of bloody crimes that stretched from Sacramento to the south, the cases suddenly stopped. No more creepy phone calls in the middle of the night, no more broken homes, no more bodies left in dark rooms. Instead, there was a deathly silence, a silence that made everyone wonder, was he dead, had left California, or was just waiting for another chance to return? The police were exhausted. Thousands of hours of investigation poured into countless scattered clues. Each generation of detectives took turns taking over the files, but in the end only left thick files. Every time the press asked, the answer was the same. No suspects, no solid evidence, no results. People gradually learned to live with the haunting, to accept that the terrormonger might be gone forever, and that justice might never come. But silence does not mean forgetting. In the minds of the survivors, he is still present every day. There are women who never dare turn off the lights at night. There are families with 3 or 4 layers of locks that still startle at every sound. There are children who grow up with their parents' morbid vigilance, always told to run to the neighbor's house if they hear broken glass or an alarm. The press still mentions him like a ghost, reminding that he was never caught, that justice has not yet completed its task. But then, over time, those reports become less frequent. People have other worries, other cases, other events to fill the front page. The Golden State Killer became a name only mentioned on anniversaries or in crime books, a dark but unfinished chapter in California history. In dusty file rooms, thousands of sealed pieces of evidence lay undisturbed in cardboard boxes. Traces of semen collected at the scene, hair, fabric fibers, shoe prints, all carefully stored but useless with the forensic technology of time. Veteran detectives still remembered haunting details. The size 9 shoes, the distinctive knots, the strange phone calls at night, the haunting whispers. But then they retired, the files were handed over, and the case gradually became a burden to a new generation. Those who did not directly live through the horrors of the 70s and 80s, but had to receive thousands of pages of documents without end. For the community, that silence was both a relief and a vague worry. Some believed he was dead or arrested for another crime. Some believed he had moved to a distant state and continued killing elsewhere, unknown, and some feared he was living right next door, pretending to be a gentle husband and a normal father, while hiding a bloody past. Rumors spread. Theories surrounding him became part of popular culture. A monstrous figure discussed at parties, recreated in detective stories, but the truth still eluded all eyes. The 90s marked the advent of DNA technology, and with it, a small glimmer of hope. Old samples were tested, and for the first time, police confirmed that the East Area Rapist and the original Night Stalker were in fact the same person. Two seemingly disparate ghosts merged into one, and the truth was chilling. A single man responsible for a series of rapes in Northern California and a series of murders in Southern California. But even with the connection, his true identity remained elusive. Hundreds of suspects were compared, hundreds of DNA samples were tested, but all were ruled out. He was still lurking somewhere, safe in the guise of everyday life, while the police groped in the dark. Throughout the 2000s, investigators kept trying to revive the case. They held press conferences, appealed to the community, promised rewards, but all brought only vague statements, leads that led nowhere. Some of the surviving victims continued to speak out, recounting their memories to keep the case from being forgotten. Some writers, journalists, and criminology enthusiasts also dug into the files, wrote books, made documentaries. But all of this only highlights the system's incompetence. Knowing so much about his behavior, about his patterns, but absolutely not knowing who he is. The Golden State Killer's silence is not a disappearance, but a hidden existence, smoldering like embers under the ashes. He no longer acts, or at least leaves no trace, but his consequences still spread in every family, each community. That fear was passed down from generation to generation, and the case gradually became iconic. A symbol of the limits of justice, a symbol of the fragility of safety, a symbol of the darkness that can reside in the midst of ordinary life. And for 40 years, no one suspected that he was still living in California, still going to the supermarket, still driving, still living a friendly neighborhood life, until the day genetic engineering. In a time when forensic technology had advanced so much since the 70s and 80s, when the Golden State Killer terrorized and then disappeared into obscurity, leaving behind dozens of unsolved cases, hundreds of thick files, and thousands of survivors or victims' relatives who never found true solace. In the early 90s, semen and hair samples from the crime scenes began to be reanalyzed using new DNA technology, and the results shocked the entire investigative agency. The rapes in Northern California and the murders in Southern California, which had previously seemed separate, were actually committed by the same person. The East Area Rapist and the original Night Stalker were not two ghosts, but one monster with many faces. The connection shocked the police and the community, proving that the man who terrorized decades ago was not only a sexual pervert, but also a cold-blooded killer, a fact that only deepened the haunting thought that he was still alive somewhere, perhaps even on the most peaceful streets. The development of forensic science opened a new era in criminal investigation, but there were still clear limitations. The killer's DNA was identified and stored in databases, but to track him down, a specific DNA match was needed, and among millions of Californians, no one's name emerged as a suitable suspect. Each year, police tested dozens, even hundreds of DNA samples from different suspects, but all were ruled out. People began to wonder, was he dead? Had he never left any official trace in the records? Or worse, was he an unlikely person, living a life so normal that he would never be suspected? Then a bold idea was born, not from the police, but from the explosion of commercial DNA testing. In the early 21st century, millions of Americans sent saliva samples to companies like Ancestry.com or 23andMe to learn about their family origins, check their lineage, find distant relatives. The genetic database was growing rapidly, and some detectives and forensic scientists realized that this information could be used to track down a murderer. If the killer did not send his DNA directly, then perhaps a distant relative did, and from the blood connections, the police could track back to narrow the area. The turning point came when an investigator decided to upload the Golden State Killer's DNA profile to GeneMatch, an open genetic database that compares information across samples from many different sources. The results turned up a series of distant relatives, from third cousins to obscure branches of the family tree. The picture was initially chaotic, but gradually, over months of genealogical work, police began to visualize a vast family tree, narrowing the field down to a few possible individuals. Among the names that emerged was one man, Joseph James DeAngelo, a former police officer who had served in Exeter and Auburn, now in his 70s, living a seemingly quiet life in Citrus Heights, Sacramento. His career history sent shivers down the detectives' spines, explaining so much: his understanding of investigative procedures, his ability to elude capture, his careful planning and tactical acumen. But even though all the signs pointed to him, the police still needed irrefutable evidence, a DNA sample directly from Joseph James DeAngelo to compare with the killer's. They watched patiently, waiting for an opportunity. One afternoon, DeAngelo threw an item into the trash outside his house, and detectives quickly collected it and brought it back to the lab. A few days later, the results confirmed there was no doubt. The DNA matched the samples from the crime scenes. After more than 40 years, the Golden State Killer was finally unmasked, and he was the thin, silver-haired man who lived peacefully as a friendly neighbor, regularly doing small repairs in the yard, chatting with people around the house. No one could have guessed that he was the monster that spread fear throughout California. News of the Golden State Killer's identification spread at breakneck speed, like a storm sweeping across the United States. Newspapers ran sensational headlines. Television broadcast images of police swooping in to arrest DeAngelo, and the public was both shocked and relieved. People were shocked that the man arrested was not a supernatural ghost, not a homeless vagrant, but a former police officer, a man once entrusted with protecting the community. The truth was both painful and bitter, because it proved that monsters do not always lurk in remote corners, but can sit at the table next to you at a coffee shop, or smile hello as you pass by his yard. Police held a press conference to announce the breakthrough thanks to genetic technology, explaining in detail the process of building a family tree and narrowing down the suspects. Experts considered this a milestone in the history of criminal investigation, opening a new era for solving long-standing cases. Dozens of victims' families burst into tears when they heard the news. Many of them could not believe that this day had come, that justice had finally found the person who had destroyed their lives. Although they knew that the arrest could not restore what was lost, it brought a form of belated justice, a confirmation that society had not completely forgotten them. The DNA revelation also raised many controversies. Some people worried that the police's use of commercial databases violated citizens' privacy. Some asked, if today it helped catch the Golden State Killer, would it be abused tomorrow to monitor innocent people? But for most, the success was proof that justice, however late, could still prevail. While scholars debated the moral and legal implications, bereaved families embraced each other in emotion, because they finally had a name, a face, a concrete person to assign to the ghost that had haunted them for 4 decades. And so, Chapter 4 ended with the triumph of science over darkness, with genetic genealogy bringing the Golden State Killer into the light. He was no longer a ghost, no longer a series of vague aliases, but Joseph James DeAngelo, a man who once wore a police badge, who once lived as a model citizen, but who was also a sick killer who sowed utter fear in California. This truth paved the way for the final chapter, where justice would finally speak, and decades of fear would be confronted with trials, confessions, and inevitable sentencing. On the morning of April 24, 2018, when the world watched as Sacramento police conducted a secret operation they had carefully prepared for months, and the name Joseph James DeAngelo, 72 years old, former police officer, quiet neighbor of many families, was dragged from his quiet home to the cold sound of handcuffs. The image of the old man with gray hair, thin, wearing a wrinkled T-shirt, the complete opposite of the haunting Golden State Killer that has sown fear for more than 40 years, spread across newspapers, television, and social media. Californians, especially those communities that had been submerged in his terrible darkness, broke out in shock and relief. Survivors, families who lost loved ones, many burst into tears when they saw the face of the man they thought had escaped the punishment of the law, now trembling in the hands of the police. As the news broke, reporters crowded outside the police station, flashbulbs flashed, and the phrase Golden State Killer once again became a headline. Prosecutors across California, from Sacramento to Ventura, announced that they would charge DeAngelo with 13 counts of murder and multiple rapes, despite knowing the true number was much higher. In the early days, DeAngelo barely spoke, sitting motionless in a wheelchair during his first court appearance, his eyes vacant, as if he had nothing to do with the numerous crimes he was accused of. His silence sparked controversy, with some believing it was a cover for weakness to gain sympathy, others believing he was truly worn out by old age. But no matter what, the truth remained. He was the monster that had haunted California for decades. The trial lasted for years, during which DNA, testimony, and irrefutable forensic evidence were presented. Victims and relatives took turns recounting horrific memories, each account like a knife cutting back decades of pain. They described nights of being held captive by him, the creepy whispers, the desperate looks as they watched their loved ones being harmed. One rape survivor wept as she said she had waited 40 years for this moment, to look him in the face and call him to justice. In 2020, in a plea deal to avoid the death penalty, DeAngelo officially confessed to 13 murders and dozens of rapes, though the true number is estimated to be higher. In the courtroom, he stood up, his face blank, his voice hoarse, whispering guilty over and over again. Those confessions echoed in the crowded room, where each guilty was like a hammer blow to the past, closing a bloody chapter that had lasted for decades. In the end, Joseph James DeAngelo was sentenced to life in prison without parole, and for the rest of his life, he would have to live within four walls as cold and lonely as the nights he had sown terror. The capture and trial of the Golden State Killer was not just the end of a case, but also a testament to the power of technology, of perseverance, and of the belief that justice, even when late, can still be served. It sent a message that those who sow evil can go unpunished for a long time, but cannot go unpunished forever. It also closed years of confusion for the California community and opened a new hope for other cold cases that still await resolution. But the story of darkness is never over, because the world of crime is always full of new mysteries, new tragedies that make people question the nature of safety and the fragility of everyday life. If the Golden State Killer was America's nightmare during the 70s and 80s, then Britain had another wound, a disappearance that became a global obsession, lasting for decades and still unsolved. The disappearance of Madeleine McCann in Portugal. Get ready for the next journey, as we step into a fateful night in 2007 in Praia de Luz, where a 3-year-old girl disappeared without a trace from her holiday apartment, and the whole world watched in shock. This will be the opening story of a new series, Madeleine McCann Disappearance: The Night in Portugal True Crime Documentary, Part 1.